The Valari had always believed themselves to be the pinnacle of sentient evolution. Not for their technological advancements, though they were considerable, nor for their graceful physiology or long lifespans. It was their minds, interwoven in a tapestry of telepathic resonance, that convinced them of their superiority. From birth, every Valari was immersed in a collective harmony, their thoughts and emotions flowing through carefully structured pathways, where empathy was not a virtue but a requirement. Dishonesty was impossible, cruelty inconceivable, and mental openness the highest form of truth. They did not speak as others did. They touched minds, directly, intimately, completely. When the humans arrived, the Valari were intrigued but unthreatened. Primitive, certainly. Emotionally unstable. Biologically fragile. Yet oddly persistent. A curiosity more than a concern. The human representatives seemed polite enough, quiet, even, if somewhat unreadable. Their emotional frequencies, what little could be detected, pulsed like static behind walls of mental stone. It was frustrating. Soren Ka, the mind emissary, had lived through 5 centuries of first contact protocols. He had calmed the screaming thoughts of insected swarms, soothed the war trauma of reptilian empaths, even mediated between sentient fungal collectives that communicated through chemical pulses of despair. But humans, these creatures smiled too easily, kept their thoughts boxed up tight, and offered no hand into the shared pool of understanding. Soren Ka found this unnatural. Dangerous, even. So, when the human ambassador, a tall woman named Mara Lin, extended her hand during the 3rd diplomatic session aboard the Unity Spire, he seized the moment, not with pride, but with the righteous obligation of a guide illuminating the dark. He would touch her mind. He would show them what empathy looked like. A hush fell over the chamber. Valari do not require silence, but those present could feel the psychic tension humming beneath their skin. Soren's fingers grazed Mara Lin's temple. Instantly, the universe tore open. There was no graceful entry, no mutual adjustment of frequencies, no exchange of controlled impressions. The human mind did not open like a book. It collapsed inward like a star, pulling everything into it. Soren Ka staggered, no, was pulled, into a maelstrom. Emotion screamed across his senses, jagged and raw. There was no harmonic structure, no layers of thought carefully ordered. There was pain, so much of it, the death of a mother, the panic of drowning, the silence of space while oxygen ran dry. He reeled, trying to stabilize, to contextualize, only to be battered by something worse, endurance. The human had felt these things, not once, but over and over. And had kept walking. Grief layered over laughter. A memory of childhood warmth cut apart by the scream of incoming fire. The first kiss under the specter of war. A hand reaching out to comfort another as the world collapsed around them. These weren't contradictions, they coexisted, side by side. The human psyche was a paradox, and it was self-aware of that paradox. Soren felt shame, too, deep, acidic shame. At mistakes made, at lives lost, at choices regretted. And yet none of it defined her. The mind before him was not seeking absolution or understanding. It had no need for psychic exposure. It had made peace with pain, and in doing so, had become untouchable. This wasn't a mind built for communion. It was a fortress. Not to keep others out, but to contain what lay within. Soren Ka screamed. The scream was not psychic. It tore from his lungs, raw and ragged. His body convulsed, eyes wide in terror. He collapsed, unconscious before he hit the ground. Mara Lin remained still, watching with a gaze that gave nothing away. She did not gloat. She did not panic. She merely waited as Valari medics surged around the fallen emissary. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was calm and clinical. "You reached in," she said, "and you saw what we carry." No one responded. The Valari delegation stood frozen, their collective empathy disrupted by what they'd just witnessed. A mind that had touched war, loss, survival, guilt, and still remained intact, still smiled, was not a mind they could comprehend. For the first time in Valari history, A psychic broke contact not from injury or incompatibility, but from overload. The human hadn't fought the touch. She had simply been, and that had been enough to shatter a master empath. And for the first time, the Valari realized there were minds in the universe that did not wish to be understood, because they had already understood themselves, at levels far deeper than any empathy could ever reach. Sorenka drifted in a void that defied his understanding. His consciousness floated, detached from his body, surrounded by echoes that weren't his. The residue of the human's mind clung to him, not as memory, but as experience, living, ongoing, and unyielding. There was no gentle dissipation of contact, no soft fading of shared thought. The human's presence had embedded itself into his psyche like molten metal cooled into bone. He had never known fear before. Not truly. Valari minds processed discomfort as an anomaly, corrected by collective empathy. But now he felt it, real, cold, ancestral terror. Not because of something done to him, but because of what he had become a witness to. The contact had lasted less than 2 seconds. But within that blink of time, he had seen a universe. A brutal, relentless, magnificent universe. Not of stars and galaxies, but of human memory. What he thought would be a chaotic stream of impulses was in fact a crushing wave of organized defiance. The mind did not lash out, it endured. With purpose. With power. He remembered the sensation of standing in a trench, rain mixing with blood, mud swallowing boots as shells screamed overhead. He felt hunger so deep it twisted the stomach into knots, and still the human walked forward. He lived moments of pure isolation, abandoned on ice-covered moons, lost at sea, buried in rubble, and in each, the human had found a reason to survive. It wasn't just pain. That would have been manageable. The real shock was clarity. The human understood the pain, accepted it, used it. It became strength, not despite suffering, but because of it. Where Valari minds unraveled under emotional weight, humans forged identities from it. Every memory was sharp, unfiltered. Childhood joys tainted by future loss, victories earned at irreversible costs, love born in the shadow of mortality. And yet nothing was hidden, nothing repressed. He saw contradictions held together through sheer will. Love alongside vengeance. Peace beside rage. Compassion beside indifference. Each emotion intensified, yet none overwhelming the core identity. Soren's training had not prepared him. He had studied chaotic species before, those ruled by impulse or driven by genetic aggression. But this wasn't chaos. It was a design. An architecture of internal fire. The human mind did not diffuse pain, it metabolized it. Converted trauma into drive, guilt into accountability, grief into memory that guided future kindness. He tried to pull away during the contact. Reflexively. But there was no edge, no boundary. The human mind offered no resistance because it never needed defense. It simply was. A vast and storm-lashed ocean with a ship sailing calmly through it, not unafraid, but determined. There was also something else. Something even more disturbing than the suffering, the hope. Fragile, irrational, unkillable. In every moment of despair, the human believed, not in fate, not in rescue, but in their own capacity to overcome. It wasn't naivety. It was a conscious rejection of surrender. Even at their lowest, they looked forward. This wasn't strength in the way Valari understood it. It wasn't about stability or unity. It was chaos bound by choice. Endurance not because of collective will, but because of individual resolve. Soren had assumed that to be psychically unreadable was a flaw. Now he understood. It was a shield born of necessity. Humanity did not share their minds because no other species could survive inside one. The last thing he felt before losing consciousness was not horror, it was awe. A realization that these creatures, these so-called primitives, were not limited by their emotional volatility. They had weaponized it. Refined it. Lived inside it every day and still built civilizations, still loved, still created beauty. In their minds lived a quiet savagery, not of violence, but of will. A refusal to break. A refusal to let the universe dictate who they would be. They were not afraid of pain. They expected it. They had made room for it, and built strength on top of it. He returned to awareness with trembling thoughts. Every Valari around him felt the tremor in his aura, the splintered edges of his once pristine psychic architecture. He had seen too much, yet it had only been a single mind. He whispered words he had never used before. They contained storms, and walked calmly through them. There was no doubt now. Humanity wasn't primitive. They were something new. Something terrifying not because of what they could do, but because of what they could endure without breaking. The medical chamber remained quiet long after Soren Ka stabilized. He had not spoken beyond fragmented whispers, but the intensity of his trauma rippled outward through the Valari neural web. His aura, once serene and centered, now flickered like a damaged conduit. Those who brushed against his mind felt static, distortion, echoes of something vast and unnatural. For the Valari, whose entire culture was founded on clarity of thought and emotional resonance, it was unprecedented. The incident shattered protocol. The Council of Empathic Relations convened within hours, not out of procedure but panic. In their history, no mind reader, let alone one of Soren's experience, had ever collapsed during a consensual bond. The implications were not merely personal, they were existential. The human diplomat, Mara Lin, waited calmly as observers and delegates whispered behind psychic barriers. She had shown no aggression, no deceit, yet the effect of the contact had rippled across the entire delegation. Some viewed her as a danger. Others, a mystery. A few, silently, as a threat far greater than any weapon. Psychic analysts surrounded Soren Ka in the hours that followed, attempting to map what had gone wrong. What they found disturbed them more than silence would have. His mind was intact, but fractured at key points, fractures formed not from damage, but from overload. When asked to describe what he experienced, he offered only one repeated phrase. They suffer and do not fall. That phrase entered Valari discourse instantly. Debates erupted across private channels. Some called for an immediate halt to all psychic contact with humans. Others feared such a restriction would appear weak, admitting that the Valari, masters of empathy, could not endure a simple exchange. Pride collided with caution. Mara Lin was questioned repeatedly by different council members. She never denied what happened, nor did she embellish. Her answers were factual, precise, almost clinical. When asked if all humans carried similar minds, she replied without pause. Pain isn't unique. Endurance is a requirement. A council elder, usually composed, demanded clarification. Do you train your minds to resist intrusion? She answered, No. We live in them. That statement, recorded and transcribed in every known Valari dialect, did more damage than a fleet of warships ever could. It wasn't defiance. It was truth. The kind that stripped illusions. Speculation grew fast. If one human held such weight internally, what of entire populations? What of those raised in war zones, in environmental collapse, in centuries of systemic hardship? If even their diplomats, presumably the most emotionally stable representatives, carried such intensity, what might a soldier contain? Or a survivor of planetary catastrophe? Some Valari proposed the theory that the human brain had evolved not for communication, but for containment. That they were not unreadable because of a flaw, but because they had adapted to endure mental environments no other species could survive. That their chaos was not disorder, but a deeper form of control. The implications were terrifying. The Valari had long held an unspoken belief that their empathic superiority placed them above other sentients. With humans, that illusion failed. They had no way to predict or influence a species that did not fear the loss of comfort, that did not crumble when exposed to their own inner abyss. One counselor attempted to justify it diplomatically. Perhaps their strength lies in their individuality. We seek harmony. They survive in conflict. Another replied. Then what does that make them when the conflict turns outward? The debate reached a crisis point. Dozens pushed for a formal reassessment of human alliances. Quiet voices whispered of danger, not because humans posed a physical threat, but because they were mentally alien in ways no one had foreseen. Impossible to control, impossible to fully understand. They could not be predicted through empathic resonance because they did not operate through shared equilibrium. They navigated suffering alone, and emerged stronger. The final decision was neither condemnation nor embrace. A temporary moratorium on mind sharing with humans was established while a comprehensive psychological reevaluation was conducted. It was a compromise, crafted not out of wisdom, but uncertainty. Before the council adjourned, one Valari, young and unranked, stood and asked the question none dared voice aloud. If this is what one human mind contains, what happens if they stop hiding them? The chamber fell silent. No answer came. No one knew. And quietly, in a sealed part of the record, a note was added to Soren Ka's profile. Not a warning, not a diagnosis, just 3 words written in old Valari script. He touched fire. The humans were not told about the restrictions. There was no official declaration, no diplomatic rupture. The Valari simply stopped requesting telepathic contact. Meetings resumed, but with a layer of politeness that felt artificial. No one mentioned Soren Ka's collapse, though his absence was conspicuous. Humanity, for its part, made no demands, issued no statements. Mara Lin continued to attend diplomatic sessions, spoke when necessary, and refrained from pressing the subject. Behind closed doors, however, the silence fractured. Valari intelligence agencies began quietly analyzing historical records, wars, colonization efforts, famines, collapses, and how humans had responded. The data presented a paradox. By all measurable standards, humanity should have succumbed to extinction multiple times. Environmental failure, self-inflicted wars, plagues, civil collapse, all should have broken them. Yet they endured. Not only endured, they advanced. It was not resilience in the biological sense. Other species survived harsh conditions through adaptation or dormancy. Humans refused dormancy. They fought the storm head-on, even when losing. There was no evolutionary advantage to this pattern. It did not increase survival odds in a predictable way. It created unpredictable outcomes, sometimes catastrophic, but often astonishing. What unsettled the Valari most was that human endurance was not instinctual. It was a choice. A conscious, repeated defiance of pain, fear, and futility. The data was clear. Entire populations had endured atrocities, yet rather than break or retreat, they built art, wrote books, created laughter amid rubble. No biological imperative explained it. Only will. One internal report phrased it best. Asterisk, they are not powered by peace. They are fueled by friction. Asterisk. Among the Valari elite, this understanding led to a deeper crisis. Their own culture had flourished for millennia by minimizing suffering, dispersing emotional burdens across their collective networks. Discomfort was a signal to resolve imbalance, not to dwell in it. But humans operated on the inverse. They absorbed suffering as part of identity. It wasn't seen as something to erase but something to earn through. A classified inquiry asked a single question: if the Valari had undergone human history, would they have survived? The answer was a unanimous no. That realization marked a quiet shift. The Valari no longer looked at humans as curiosities. They began to see them as survivors of something no other species had faced: themselves. Generation after generation of self-inflicted struggle had not dulled their spirit, it had sharpened it. Mara Lin, without ever raising her voice or revealing classified knowledge, began to be perceived not as a representative, but as a warning. Every word she spoke carried weight not because it was threatening, but because it wasn't. She did not need to threaten. Her existence, her calm, was threat enough. It became clear that human diplomacy operated on a subtle layer of implied understanding. They rarely showed their full capacity, emotionally, strategically, or intellectually. They wore masks not to deceive, but to protect. Not themselves, but others. From what might be unleashed if those masks were removed. The Valari began to speculate about deeper levels of containment. If a diplomat's mind nearly destroyed a master empath, what might the minds of their leaders hold? Their generals? Their scientists? What reservoirs of emotion, memory, drive, and trauma sat locked behind disciplined smiles? One Valari observer, after weeks of non-telepathic interviews, noted something chilling. They do not fear collapse. They build in anticipation of it. That insight struck at the core of Valari philosophy. Collapse was to be avoided at all costs. Harmony was the objective. But humans expected the collapse. They planned for it. Trained for it. They even mythologized it, in stories where worlds ended and heroes rose from the ashes. Destruction, for them, was not failure. It was transformation. From this, a second unsettling truth emerged: humans evolved to begin again. They were not merely good at survival. They were designed, mentally and socially, to start over with nothing. That trait made them unpredictable and unstoppable in ways no technology could counter. The Valari Council reclassified humanity internally. Not as a threat, not as an ally, but as a contingency. A species whose existence must be factored into every equation, not because of hostility, but because of their innate capacity to thrive in environments others could not endure. That evening, as Mara Lynn prepared to leave the Unity Spire for her next assignment, a junior Valari envoy approached her privately. He did not attempt a telepathic link. He simply bowed, and with difficulty spoke aloud. "We see you now." She nodded once. "Then be careful what you look for." Humanity was no longer underestimated. Quietly, without confrontation, the perception shifted. The Valari, once confident in their superiority of mind, began restructuring their diplomatic doctrine. Humanity wasn't a species to pacify or manipulate. They were now a constant in every long-term calculation. Not because of dominance, but because of durability. They had seen the inside of a human soul and realized no system could account for it. Soren Khan never fully returned to his former role. His insights were preserved, studied, but his mental structure bore irreversible marks. Yet he was not broken, only changed. In private sessions, he described the human experience not with dread, but with reluctant reverence. What once felt like chaos he now called layered order. They weren't primitive minds. They were minds with depth beyond Valari comprehension. Each trauma stacked upon the next like armor, not scars. The Valari's most advanced empathic algorithms were deployed to analyze the linguistic patterns of human communication. Beneath jokes, small talk, and diplomacy, they found persistent emotional duality, grief nested within humor, fury tempered by restraint, loneliness offset by creative expression. They saw not randomness, but mastery of inner storms. Humans had learned not to destroy their demons, but to live alongside them. It was not peace they sought, but meaning, even in anguish. A series of test cases were launched, pairing human volunteers with Valari mentors under strict observation. The outcomes varied, but one pattern emerged consistently: humans process psychic feedback far better than anticipated. In fact, some thrived on it. They didn't recoil from emotional weight. They absorbed it, learned from it, adapted in real time. Several Valari mentors withdrew early, overwhelmed not by hostility but by intensity. One subject, a human medic with battlefield experience, allowed limited contact. The Valari felt the lives she had failed to save. The screaming of the wounded. The numbness after. But also the steadiness that followed, the decision to return to the next disaster, and the one after that. The will to continue was not masked, it was central. It wasn't heroic in the conventional sense. It was mechanical, practiced, deliberate. Like breathing. The Valari began to grasp something they had never considered: endurance was a skill in humans, not a reaction. It could be honed, taught, passed down generationally. A learned art of remaining functional despite emotional catastrophe. They realized their mistake, assuming survival was accidental, circumstantial. For humans, it was engineered. Culturally reinforced. Praised, even romanticized. A confidential report concluded that humans existed on a threshold of constant internal conflict, but maintained cohesion by making that conflict part of their identity. They did not wait for equilibrium, They functioned in its absence. That made them dangerous not in aggression, but in capacity. When faced with collapse, others hesitated. Humans moved. More troubling was the implication that their strength grew under pressure. Their greatest innovations, alliances, philosophies, all forged under existential stress. War, disaster, moral failure, none of it weakened them long term. It tempered them. Scar tissue became callous. Callous became discipline. Discipline became doctrine. Pain wasn't something to avoid. It was something to outlast. One Valari academic proposed a new model for cross-species understanding. Not based on harmony, but tension. The idea met resistance. Tension, in Valari thought, signaled instability. But in human systems, tension meant resilience. The tightrope between fear and courage was where their strength lived. Stability wasn't their goal. Movement was. The Council, after long deliberation, amended the interspecies protocol. All future engagements with humans would prioritize context over assumption. Their emotional expression was no longer to be viewed as volatility, but as signal. A warning. Or a promise. In a final, unrecorded exchange, Soren Ka was asked if he would ever link with a human again. His answer was slow, but firm. No. Once was enough. Not for fear. For respect. As the human delegation departed Valari space, the stars behind their ship were unchanged. But those watching understood something fundamental had shifted. No longer did they see humanity as a species to uplift or control. Now they saw them as equal, if not more prepared for what lay beyond. Because if the universe ever turned truly dark, if the known systems ever collapsed into chaos and ruin, it would not be the most peaceful who survived. It would be the ones who had already lived inside that darkness and walked through it with fire in their eyes.